This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all to the 2011 Holden Lecture. The lecture is an annual occasion named after the architect of this building, and you have a wonderful example in this splendid room of Charles Holden. We are really privileged, and I just want to say a bit why, to have the director of Senate House Library speaking to us tonight. Chris Pressler is a man of many parts. If I just indicate that he has that his degrees cover this range, he did a degree in information management, he did a degree in creative writing, and he did his first degree in history and music. Now, you know, the conventional phrases, and my interests are, and those things take second place or third place to one's occupation. But actually, these interests are all extremely well developed. We have a novel published in 2003 called Canning Circus, which is subtitled The Novel Under and Over Nottingham. We have criticism on the work of Jean Winterson. Chris is an accomplished musician, a violinist, I believe, and has been part of a music group at Dartington, where there were a number of performances. He has been, he worked at JISC, and is, retains an interest in digital management and humanities. He's chair of the International Conference on Digital Research in the Humanities and Arts, and chair of the Research Libraries UK Board on Research Communication, and he's co-director of DAUNT, which is the European e-thesis service. So he keeps a very active interest in digital humanities. We are, I think, very lucky indeed that he's turned to library and research, and will no doubt give to it what he has already done in his other areas of interest. He includes on his website, which is really worth looking at, a list of interests which will make any of us pause, which beside librarianship includes writing, films, music, Irish history, urban art, which this building might be an example of, British opera, and then some cities, which really warmed my heart. Nottingham, Cambridge, Belfast, London. And then we have politics and China to round off this list of interests. So, I fully expect that this address tonight, Borges meets Orwell, the 21st Century Research Library, is going to reflect this immense range of interests, which of course libraries themselves embrace. And the last thing I want to say is that the music that we will listen to is also something that Chris has played in part of his favorites. He's going to speak tonight, yes, on Borges meets Orwell.
Well, thank you, Laurel, for that embarrassingly rich introduction. I will try and deliver a Renaissance man's lecture and not let you down or the friends down. I'd like to begin actually by thanking the Friends of Senate House Library for inviting me to give this year's Charles Holden Lecture. And I'd like to take this genuinely prestigious opportunity to offer some thoughts on where I believe the priorities and strengths lie for research libraries in the 21st century. I'll view research libraries, however, alongside the future of research universities, as their fates are inextricably linked. For the most part in this lecture, I'm also considering collections in the humanities and social sciences, as this is my own professional field, and also the principal role of our libraries here at Senate House. And finally, I will view the world of knowledge through the eyes of two writers, two of my favourite writers as it happens. At first glance, there may be little similarity between the works of Borges and Orwell. From the perspective of a librarian, however, and that long list of interests, by the way, is quite common in librarians, to be honest, I hope to explore how each man has constructed and investigated truth. And it's the elusive concept of truth that is at the heart of this year's lecture, as it is also at the heart and the centre of how I believe, through the act of collecting, libraries find purpose and meaning. To elaborate on the essential contribution made by libraries to the research process, it's important to first provide a context. Most importantly, it is critical to note what may be seen as the obvious, that all libraries are not the same. The context of libraries is defined, I think, by three areas: coverage, intensivity, and scale. In terms of coverage, science libraries differ from humanities libraries. It's possible to measure the value of science libraries by usage, either physically or online. Science and medical librarians rarely interpret in a rich sense their collections, their principal role being to provide access. Few people enter the library profession with higher science degrees. There are some notable exceptions to that, of course. In the humanities, the partnership between librarians and our readers is often deeper, owing to shared academic experience. Usage is key to the humanities too, but what happens inside the library, beyond the gate, is very different between science and humanities collections. In terms of intensivity, teaching collections are not as complex as research collections. Management processes drive teaching-intensive collections. The role of the library is to follow course tutors in the provision of multiple copies of books and online materials which support reading lists. This is not necessarily an oversimplification, but just a statement of the primary role. Acquisition and disposal are repetitive, as I know from previous posts, and uncomplicated tasks. There are important training and information literacy contributions made by the library, but the collection development itself is not the key role. In research-intensive collections, the reverse is true, where some teaching support is provided, but the roots of expertise lie in knowledge of extensive holdings and in their continued growth. In terms of scale, and in an attempt perhaps to state the obvious even more clearly, large libraries change in different ways to small libraries. Scale is definitive, in that the future of small libraries is likely to be fundamentally divergent to that of large libraries. The future of small libraries has already been transformed by the internet age. In the next 5 years, a relatively small teaching collection will be effectively redundant due to mass digitization programs of texts and the greater availability and acceptance of e-books. These libraries will focus on training and designing collaborative spaces. The large research library has a more complex future. Many millions of materials will remain in print and analogue form. Many more will continue to be produced in those forms or with digital surrogates. The interpretation, management and expansion of research collections will become ever more multifaceted. And I think this will be most acute in the arts, humanities and social sciences. The three facets above context in which libraries operate within universities present themselves in a particular way for us at Senate House. Our collections constitute very large research collections in the arts, humanities and social sciences. The librarian's role is complex because of higher degree or subject knowledge. The collection is complex because it is based on expansion and depth rather than relegation and recycling. The scale is important because it affects the library's ratio between future print and digital collections, a ratio fast disappearing in smaller institutions. Libraries in other research-intensive environments share these characteristics, such as in the larger members of the Russell Group. However, there are two additional factors that define the role of libraries in the process of research facilitation at Senate House. Firstly, many of the collections are not only large, but in fact are amongst the finest of their fields in the world. Secondly, a considerable percentage of these collections are held on the open shelf in central London. Could we make it any harder for ourselves? This provides a unique provision of internationally important materials made readily accessible, and I think defines the role of Senate House in the UK sector and as a partner of the British Library, whose collections, of course, are principally closed access.
No longer can it be said that we like to read. My friends and I, we don't like the way books feel in our hands. It's not true that I don't follow trends. I know what I want when I see it, and packaging is more important than content. I have to tell you, my attention span is too small for big ideas. And it's just not true that I read a lot and I like learning. I don't care. And you should never think I've got to be concerned with environment and sustainability. What I really hope you get is you've got to open your eyes to my values. What's important to me is what Lady Gaga is wearing. And I don't really care all that much what Gandhi did last century. I think it's unbelievable that you're actually listening to us. What's important for you is you'll find customers for your products. You think your job's done if we like your brand. We'll do it for you on Facebook, on our mobiles, me and my friends. Your market is dying. Don't think it's all going to survive. It is the end of the publishing industry as we know it. Unless you reverse how you see me. It is going to survive. Don't think that it's all dying. Your market is me and my friends. On our mobiles, on Facebook, we'll do it for you. If we like your brand, your job's done. You'll think of products for your customers. You'll find what's important for you is that you're actually listening to us. I think it's unbelievable what Gandhi did last century. I don't really care all that much what Lady Gaga is wearing. What's important to me is you've got to open your eyes to my values. What I really hope you get is I've got to be concerned with environment and sustainability. And you should never think I don't care. I read a lot and I like learning. And it's just not true that my attention span is too small for big ideas. I have to tell you, content is more important than packaging. I know what I want when I see it, and I don't follow trends. It's not true that we don't like the way books feel in our hands. My friends and I, we like to read. No longer can it be said that books are dead and boring, and this is the end of publishing.
The nature of humanities, social science and arts research still requires engagement with and the development of large physical collections. The principal research outputs in these fields are still in printed form. Research libraries in the broader humanities, though, are not merely stores. A research project is a partnership between the researcher and the library, from the earliest survey of current materials to the interpretation of materials or digital environments, and finally, perhaps to the placement of that research in the setting of the library. Research is concerned with discovery, and libraries are its essential mode of travel. Funds spent on libraries as a generic service are an entirely different matter to those spent on world-class, unique, rich collections in the heart of London. The remit, for instance, of my colleagues in the School of Advanced Study is to act as a focus, as a symposium for research, facilitation in the arts, humanities and social sciences in the UK. This is performed in central London for a reason. You can get away with this if you've got a Belfast accent. As part of the greatest concentration of libraries anywhere in the world. Nowhere else in the UK can offer this combination of access, intellectual importance and geographical setting. In 1936, the architect of Senate House, Charles Holden, began building this Art Deco masterpiece. The library is designed to be a building that would only stand naturally in London. There are echoes of the lives of other great universities, such as with the inclusion of cloisters, but Holden did not design faux medieval or classical copies. The cloisters at Senate House are ideas born of elegance, purity, integrity and coherence. As in all the vast spaces of Senate House, they are epic in every sense. Senate House was designed to stand as the centre, or at the centre, of the third great English university, if you want to call us that. It was to be a university rooted in the contemporary world and only at home in the world's capital. Holden designed to a level of detail unusual even amongst the finest architects. There is a Greek motif, variations of which decorate not only the architraves of the front elevation of the building, but also the backs of chairs, the staircases and railings, the mouldings of doors and cornices, and even some of the wood panelling in this room. Every single one of thousands of light fittings is an Art Deco original. Perhaps the most striking infrastructural feature of the building, though, is its least known. Senate House can only ever be a library. From floor 7 to floor 19, the supporting mechanism for this early skyscraper is bookshelves. They're welded into the skeleton girders and rise in perfect symmetry for about 200 feet over London. If you ever want to sense what it is to have millions of books directly above your head, just stand in the foyer of Senate House. The public floors of 4 to 7 are, particularly I think in the cases of floors 5 and 6, spaces of almost indescribable immensity. There are some views, if you know where to look, where it is almost possible to see roughly from the north to the south of the building. It's as though the great circle of the British Museum reading room has been rolled out flat. There are others when, for instance, walking into the goldsmith's reading room, where your breath will be taken away, removed, if you like, for a short time before being dutifully replaced in order that you might continue researching. Goldsmiths is a room built specifically for a collection of the same name, the Goldsmiths Collection of Economic Literature. Dating from the 15th century to the 21st century, there are some exceptional items and important strata, such as the history of slavery. The room itself has lines of bookshelves carved from English walnut and a ceiling in cedar, resulting in a large stained glass version of the University Arms. 2 rows of high windows provide extra height to a room that I believe to be the most beautiful traditional academic library space in Britain. For the record, the number 2 might be claimed by the Wren Library at Trinity, Cambridge, and the number 3 perhaps by John Rylands at Manchester. There are many further examples of Holden's genius and clarity of vision throughout his great white library. The essential thing to note, though, is that this is an epic building made of comparative microcosms. Its architectural coherence means that when you close your fingers around a door handle, you are symbolically holding the entire tower. In the next few weeks, our long refurbishment will be one stage closer to completion. This has painstakingly recast Senate House in its original 1930s elan, where we could do it. Most pieces of furniture, also most of which were designed by Holden, have been reconditioned. Light fittings have been removed and cleaned. It will give back to London its tallest Art Deco structure. Following so much original care, under Charles Holden's pencil and the enormous effort of the refurbishment project, we must be equally thoughtful about how we create a research experience that is not only surrounded by Art Deco wonders, but inspired by them. Senate House was born of clear design principles. There are many projects to be undertaken at the library, but perhaps one of the most important now is to rethink our physical and web presence in terms that would meet with Holden's agreement. For a man who designed almost every armchair in the building, he could, I'm sure, be guaranteed to have had an opinion on our website. There are many great new library buildings, but in general, they are either driven by public or teaching agendas, which moreover means that there are generally either very few books or there are thousands of similar ones. Senate House is a tower of research materials, millions of individual items. We should be clear concerning what we are aiming for. An epic library is not one solely defined by its collections, but one where its products and services, to appropriate terms from commerce, are recognised to be driven by principles, not just profit, or in our case, reader numbers. This means that we intend to develop services around these four words: elegance, purity, integrity, and coherence. This would be an aim, of course, that would sit easily with most large libraries, but at Senate House we have an added incentive. Holden is breathing down, certainly our necks. Our responsibility is not only to English heritage to ensure that the light fittings are correct. Our accountability is to Charles Holden. We must, so far as possible, place nothing in these spaces that wrestles with the original design, which includes the two tables over there, by the way. We must, again, as far as possible, create services within the building and on our websites that are true to Holden's ideas on simplicity and usability. In short, the Senate House Library design principles were written in 1936, but now need to be reinvigorated for the 21st century. For a research library of the intellectual depth of Senate House, no detail should be considered too small. That the collections are held in a building formed from design principles of modernist simplicity is an important opportunity. Senate House confirms its function and usability by adhering to those principles. Integrity is derived through clearly stating purpose. The purpose of Senate House was made physical by Holden and will be secured for the future by allowing the objects and designs of the contemporary world to integrate with their Art Deco surroundings. Every technology, every sightline, every website, every product and every service in such an important building needs to be considered in terms of design as something people interact with. Everything we do in the library must have a rationale. The library is not a new idea. In fact, librarians may well lay claim to being one of the oldest professions, well, hopefully not the oldest profession, personally speaking. The Latin author and grammarian Aulus Gellius describes the birth of the library as both a concept and tactile collection like this in around 150 AD. The tyrant Pisistratus is said to have been the first to possess books of the liberal arts that were to be supplied for the public's reading at Athens. Later, the Athenians themselves augmented them in a learned and accurate manner, but after Xerxes obtained the whole abundance of books and had burned the city apart from its citadel, he took them away and brought them to Persia. Then the Seleucid king called Nicanor took care that all the books were returned to Athens a long time later. As an aside, this may be the first recorded case of the bane of the librarian's life, the late return of books. The narrative, which is quoted in full in a recent book by Yunli Tu, The Idea of the Library in the Ancient World, is a description of the beginnings of the library in Greco-Roman antiquity. Not only is the description a clear attempt to claim the idea of the library as Greek, rather than Babylonian or Assyrian, but it's also a clear picture of the library as a collection of texts that is passed down from ruler to ruler, from society to society, across cultures, until it arrives in Alexandria, the great iconic library of the past. It crucially retains the library of as two notes, the identity of library, indeed the library. In this sense, the Library of Antiquity is also global, being the only collection of its time. Smaller, certainly, than our own world collection, but then the world was smaller and less known then. What I believe we share with ancient culture in our understanding of the role of the library is a sense that knowledge can be passed from generation to generation. It may happen faster and in more ways now, but information was a shared, precious and powerful commodity in antiquity as it is for us. Texts were carried from past to present, and it is this narrative, unbroken and incorruptible, that gives the library its power and validity. In antiquity, the very act of collecting, of bringing together many texts, injects into each book an added command over the population. The early library is the material meaning of the phrase safety in numbers. As the library has passed through the centuries, it results in fascinating concepts that outlive anyone who cares for it. Our lifetimes are nothing in comparison to the immortality of the collections we receive and add to and leave for others. This process of what might be called textual adoption creates canonicity, certainly, and as Xerxes and Hitler and many others knew, books mean power. So the library that has been passed to us in many forms and is most recently constituted as the internet is a trajectory of political power, of stories, of wealth, of failure, and of the determination of human beings to record and collect and organise and preserve. The library of today is a continuum of the library recorded by Gellius. Indeed, all research libraries prove that knowledge is not linear because of rediscovery. Libraries are labyrinths. The writer perhaps most concerned with the power of books is Borges. This writer can be read in as many ways as he wrote, as magical realist, as literary science fiction, as surrealist poet, or as avant-garde essayist. Behind all of these epithets, though, there remains an extraordinarily honest mind, it seems to me. Borges' ability to imagine mazes was in one sense the lifelong achievement of the finest deception. It is a fiction made of lies, in the strictest sense, because the work proposes the existence of worlds that cannot be true. However, it is based on the reality of Borges' own mind, his own personal worldview, and I would be the last to call any great writer a liar simply because he could not prove the physical existence of one of his creations. His profession defined Borges as much as politics and artistic antecedents influenced him. No writer has reimagined the entirety of human knowledge in such compellingly brief detail. The only other notable attempt, perhaps, although not a literary one, was by Dewey. The library, for Borges, himself a librarian of international importance, became eternally associated with the concept of labyrinths. Within this construct, we find the true Borges. His heroes and heroines play out their lives in what, at first glance, appear to be environments unknown to the laws of physics or the convictions of religion. Incidentally, it's this aspect of his work that makes him, I think, more than a writer of beautiful stories. It means his stories are genuinely controversial in the challenges they set to our own understanding of what is possible in terms of science, or what may be possible in terms of religion. Borges is important as an artist because he takes a position between the two great modern sides of the debate on human purpose, or its absence. On one side, the apparently unassailable evidence found in atoms, and on the other, the equally impregnable certainty held by billions of people that they are in direct contact with a deity. Borges' position, though, is not that of the agnostic, which would get him nowhere, and would make his labyrinth nothing more than a mental toy. His writing is derived from a third truth, that art itself can offer an answer to the confusion of life. In Borges' Labyrinth, we find a place literally built on the entire measurement of human knowledge and experience. This is his literary vision. Additionally, we see an environment that most closely resembles the only atmosphere that could support such epic, discoverable life, the library. When Borges achieved his long-held dream of becoming the librarian of the National Library of Argentina, it was a dream realized initially as a nightmare. He said, "God finally gave me all the books I had craved and then removed my sight." It was a cruelty akin to Beethoven's deafness or Ravel's apraxia, but it did not halt either Borges' reading or his ability to conceive works of art. In his short story, The Library of Babel, Borges merges his professional understanding of libraries with his personal view of the ultimate authority of texts. The library is endless, containing all the knowledge in the world. It is populated by people, acting here as eternal librarians, who move amongst the endless shelves and pointless spirals of books. They are searching for a way to comprehend this place of comprehensive knowledge. In the hexagonal rooms of Babel, Borges created the most compelling description not only of libraries, but also, it might be said, of the internet. Owing to the epic deception of his imagination, we are also shown the truth about libraries from a rare perspective, that of a librarian who was also a writer of genius. Borges holds a view common to librarians that it is the knowledge itself, the books indeed, which are the real purpose. The act of collecting is its own religious fervour and its own scientific proof. The purpose of libraries is not to reflect human knowledge or trends, but to exist beyond these things. In imagining something from nothing, Borges uniquely describes an everything. It is a literary device, no doubt, but also one envisioned by professional conviction, resulting in a library containing all other lies and truths. This library needs to be understood for what it is, a precious and valuable resource. The Library of Babel is, in that sense, no different from any other. It is a construct owned by the public. Books form libraries, and each book is created in private for public use. A single book is a library of references, reflections, and rediscoveries. When placed beside another, it becomes a collection. As part of a group of millions, it transforms towards Babel. Borges, perhaps, could not have predicted that librarians who began practicing in the last 10 years have had the phrases, "the death of the book" and "the end of libraries" ringing in our ears for most of our careers. Yet, relegate a book to the store and you invite letters to national publications. Reduce opening hours and be prepared to sit through aggressive student committees, and in both cases, rightly so. If libraries are dying, a lot of people haven't noticed. Libraries in all their forms are organisations managing the delivery and care of intellectual content to all disciplines and to all aspects of society. They are often multi-million-pound services with hundreds of staff serving tens of thousands of people, and they are linked across the world as the global library. Individual libraries have never been the only source of information, but they have always been the most significant point of access. One of the finest characteristics of humans is our ability to share. In the academic library context, this has meant, and is still defined by, libraries' contribution to the archiving and rediscovery of human action. This has allowed us to provide access to quality research through the global library and to offer help, space and time to students and researchers in traditional library reading rooms and collaborative learning centres. At the heart of all universities, the library in its many facets continues to balance tensions between print and digital collections, between the demands of teaching and research, between the arts and sciences, and perhaps most importantly, between the commercial supply of research information and support for its creation in academic practice. Libraries are present at the generation of ideas in delivering content to the desktop and to the desktop. They deliver in perpetuity for results and theories. Libraries bring people into contact with innovation, with innovators, and with each other. They draw an inconceivably long line of thought in every discipline to the minds of current thinkers. Libraries are critical in our need to share and to discover. They are vital in allowing access to our recorded thoughts by those who follow us. Ranganathan's 5 Laws of Library Science, those of you who've been privileged enough to go to library school will remember them, are principles upon which the practice of librarianship still rests. Books are for use. Every reader his book or her book. Every book its reader. Save the time of the reader. The library is a growing organism. These typically succinct compressions of what it means to manage vast quantities of information for an immeasurable number of readers have carried the world's library services through some unsettling times. The question is, are they still relevant in a world where so much content is beyond the library walls? The internet is the railway of our generation. It has transformed life, or at least in the Western world. The library profession took a while to realise that it, unfavourably caricatured as we often are, had found itself in the midst of the greatest shift in human society for generations. Librarians, once guardians of knowledge, had become its inertia, or so has been alleged by parts of academia. I have heard keynote speakers at conferences challenging my profession to wake up in the early years of the web or give up more recently. We have all read statements by people critical of libraries who are not necessarily themselves criticised for collection management decisions, affectionately known in the profession, by the way, as the bin. People who do not sit in student union meetings trying to find an answer as to why, this is a real example, why it is no longer possible to read D.H. Lawrence at 3 a.m. in the library. People, in summary, that do not actually manage libraries, or perhaps people, and this includes many in government, who seem to think that all libraries are the same. It is perhaps not fully comprehended that for the most part the use of one library is in fact the use of all the world's libraries. The systems of interlibrary loans and now shared digital resources allows access to quantities of books and electronic content across countries and continents, halted only by licenses and local laws. Commentators who use the term the future of libraries do imply an understanding that all libraries are in some way linked. What is missing in defining the future of libraries in this way is that not all libraries serve the same purpose. In the past, size has been important. Universities have used their libraries not only to appeal to students, but also to researchers, who in turn have added depth to the collection. In this way, libraries have been major contributors to the formation of hierarchy in British universities, not only in themselves, but also in what they support and whom they attract. Google currently holds the cards to the ability of these institutions to continue to think of their libraries as special in this way. When Google extricates itself from the courts, they will release 10 million and counting digitised books onto the internet. That's not the ones you find on Google Scholar now, that's the whole book. In the UK, this has the potential to level the playing field between the Russell Group and those with important but perhaps smaller collections in the 1994 group, and those with very different libraries in the rest of the sector. Google will mean, if not immediately, then certainly soon, that all universities will have similar library collections. However, despite its current position, Google is only an example of how the world is changing around our libraries. Very few companies exist forever, or survive unchanged and unchallenged. Many of the materials in research libraries will outlive us and will need care long after Google itself becomes a footnote. The content of libraries teaches us much, but the most important lesson is that change is constant. Additionally, printed or digitised, Ranganathan's laws remind us that the library is made up of more than books. A library is space, collections, readers, and librarians. Google is focused at the moment on collections, as is the case with almost all technology companies. As an advertising company, it's not surprising that it wishes to use content to attract advertisers to its services. In fact, we perhaps could learn a lot from them. What might be learned reciprocally is that the library as a space filled with people is a part of Google's future. It is not closed by it. I remember two things most clearly training as a librarian: the unpredictability of questions at the inquiry desk and the demand and queues at the issue desk. I still see both in libraries. Even with many services available online and self-issue now ubiquitous, readers continue to visit the physical library, and they still expect to find librarians in it. Of course, there are discipline variations for the academic library. Its physical use is less important to science, perhaps, than the humanities, although content is still managed in both fields by the library. There are also the differences in libraries. For most academic libraries, electronic resources have been transformative. Early English books online, for example, effectively put the Bodleian onto the shelves of universities that could never have afforded the original materials. For the large research libraries, like ourselves, the opportunity to redefine historic and special collections as the heart of their service is the next iteration of the hybrid library. The near future for all libraries will depend on genuine innovation in their web presences. The distant future for research libraries will be defined by an acceptance that size is no longer everything, but that close collaboration between librarians and academics in exploiting the complex web in parallel with dynamic access to historic collections will be what readers want. In the future, the library will continue to be a growing organism. In this final section, I'd like to address the politicization of culture, including libraries, and in particular the chronic underfunding in this area, and why this can never be described as strategic. War is always costly, but the culture it is fundamentally waged to defend is viewed as cheap. This is wrong. Orwell was inspired to use the library at Senate House as the Ministry of Truth in his novel 1984. His wife at the time was working in Senate House during World War II, as it had been commissioned by the government to provide accommodation for the Ministry of Information. On the roof of the library, some of you may have seen it, there are still the disconnected phone lines direct to the cabinet war rooms. Senate House was the tallest building in London at the time, apart from the crucifix on top of St Paul's Cathedral, and the library acted as a viewing tower to watch for the Luftwaffe coming up the Thames to bomb central London. The library played an important part in the defence of London. Orwell still plays an essential role in the defence of freedom. Orwell wrote this in his anti-pacifist essay, No, Not One. This seems to me a clear and realistic position to take on the matter of aggression and a viable response to it. If you'll allow me a personal period just in the closing part of the lecture, I've struggled with an innate pacifism for many years, formed on the streets of what we now refer to as late 20th century Belfast. We used to call it the Troubles. When you live amongst violence, you quickly grow to hate it. Yet I was aware that others, older and braver than myself, stood between the bombers and me. Now, these people certainly seem a lot younger, but they still stand between my life and those who, despite how distant this may seem to us, still want to harm us. Orwell authored hundreds of essays. These are often published alongside reviews of other people's books, as it was often his habit to use a book review to discuss his own views of the novelist's concerns. No, Not One is a famous dismissal of pacifism, but is in fact a book review, this time of Alex Comfort's No Such Liberty, which was published in 1941. Orwell thought quite openly that most reviewers were idiots, forced by the need to be paid to say that all books were good, as the publishers were advertising in the Sunday papers. And by the way, he included himself in that. The thrust behind No, Not One is that society is imperfect. It is faced with brutal decisions as a permanent state of being, and that any attempt to say otherwise is precious, unrealistic, and dangerous, Orwell's words. When Orwell writes, as Nazism becomes dominant in Europe, it is too easy to reduce the authority of his voice to a particular time. He writes of his own desperate present, but also of ours and of the future. There will always be war. There will always be violence. There will always be conflict. There will forever be a need for some to stand between the armed and the unarmed. As one of the most important observers of English culture, Orwell makes two fairly blunt statements in this book review. Firstly, that, as he puts it, the working classes are never pacifists because they live so close to violence. Secondly, that those who are pacifist hold a fake moral superiority based only on the real sacrifices made by others. We know Orwell didn't pull his punches. They conveniently forget, perhaps we conveniently forget, about those who stand between what Orwell calls their research lives and the gun. To Orwell, pacifism was a sign of luxury. This is not to say that war is good, it isn't. The question is, how do we respond to violence? Orwell, at least, had the defence of Western civilization to call for, and he knew his enemy. I did not think anything of seeing, on the walk to school in Belfast, a Land Rover with its rear doors open and soldiers with machine guns hanging out the back. I thought nothing of going to bed with a constant sound of helicopters and the frequent, mostly distant sound of bombs or gunfire. I only experienced a bomb physically once. This is not to say that violence is ever justified as an end to itself. Defence is one thing, but peace is a greater aim. The problem is, many people do not want peace. The choice between submitting to Nazism and fighting it was no choice at all, as Orwell saw it. And he knew it. He knew that it mattered who won, even as he was honest in criticising Britain's own imperial aggression. Orwell makes us face this choice, just as he did his own readers during the Blitz. He balances this overt support for the state, of course, with vicious attacks on it. In his major essay, Why I Write, he says political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. This is not contradictory, it is reality. Orwell physically fought in Spain, famously being shot through the throat, but his major contribution was to write books. He stands for knowledge and stood for honesty. To stand against violence means to stand in the line of fire. When the musket ball tore through the jacket, it carried with it some of the gold braiding from the Admiral's uniform. It drove through his shoulder and came to a halt inside one of his lungs. Nelson never stood a chance. The surgeon steadied himself on the creaking boards of HMS Victory and dug into the dying man's chest. He pulled out the musket ball and held it up to the light between his fingers for a few seconds. He made, and he was called Beatty, he made an historic decision. This was no ordinary musket ball. Not only had he just retrieved it from within Britain's finest military hero, but it glittered as the gold braid had burned into the metal on entry. He handed it to a colleague who pocketed it. The surgeon heard the whisper of Nelson's voice before he died in front of his fellow sailors. Over 200 years later, a film crew arrived at Windsor Castle to make a documentary on the royal collections. The highlight of the entire programme, for me, is the camera slowly panning across a polished tabletop before halting over a gold locket. We only see how tiny it is when white-gloved fingers begin to open it. Inside is a musket ball with small pieces of gold braiding embedded in the rough sphere. The cultural heritage sector is persistently under direct financial threat and being asked to justify its purpose. Simultaneously, billions of pounds are spent in the UK every month on placing contemporary soldiers and sailors in the line of fire. Britain has always been a fighting nation, and as an Irishman, I think I can probably get away with something along the lines of, it's fair to say that it's probably started more wars than it has been drawn into. Only a few have genuinely been in self-defence, but to be honest, That's not the concern on the whole. What's important is that there's an absence of balance in our national budget. Our history is viewed as less important than our future. It begins in school, where the sciences, those great disciplines of discovery, are plainly seen to be more significant than the other great disciplines of unearthing in the humanities. It continues in universities, where the humanities are always considered to be of less use to society because they cost less to teach and research. They only cost less because they do not receive enough money. At the other end of the scale, the Large Hadron Collider, bear with me, whose purpose, if you'll forgive me, seems gravely pointless, as a need for God will still exist in the minds of most people, even if it's proved that two entities colliding resulted in the universe. Where did those particles come from if they are responsible for everything? You can tell I'm not a scientist. This is a machine that has cost almost enough to fund all historical research in most universities around the world for many, many years. What more could have been understood about humanity with that money? Beyond education and into the world of government funding, the questions become more serious on a daily basis. I'm not dismissing, for example, the need for Britain to have global military reach. I'm a mere librarian. I do challenge the assumption that the past and future can be experienced without reference, that the present and future, apologies, can be experienced without reference to the past. In other words, that soldiers can march now without knowing why he or she is there, based on access to properly funded museums, libraries, universities and galleries, which are developed through suitably funded research. We are informed endlessly that by the government, any government, that the country needs to cut its cloth accordingly, or that we cannot live beyond our means. These statements are pretty irritating to me as they're so obvious. Every person in the UK does both of those things every time they enter a supermarket. The UK has enough money to fund defence and culture. Stop triggering sales in art galleries. Stop threatening museums. Stop closing libraries. Nelson took a bullet, not for war itself, but because he believed in what he was fighting for, the cultural significance and standing of his country. That tiny gold-spattered shot represents our history. We can hold it and see it only because the cultural heritage sector exists. The research library of the 21st century has a secure future if we can confidently state its purpose. It is a role in support of education, of course, but also, and perhaps nowhere more acutely than at Senate House in central London, it is a role in collaboration with other cultural heritage institutions. Orwell shows us why sometimes we may need to fight. Borges weaves images of what we are fighting for. Borges, in his miniature story starring Shakespeare, called Everything and Nothing, describes how when Shakespeare meets God, the poet says, "I, who have been so many men in vain, want to be one and myself." The voice of the Lord answered from a whirlwind, "Neither am I anyone. I have dreamt the world as you dreamt your work, my Shakespeare, and among the forms in my dream are you, who, like myself, are many and no one." In Borges' last story, Shakespeare's Memory, a man is given the entire mind of the poet. As it gradually overwhelms him, he passes it on. Borges believed that the words of one man and the words of all men and that are the words of all men, and that the construct of the library is where they are to be found. In the library, we are all Shakespeare. The purpose of research libraries in the 21st century is to exist. Without them, we are lessened. Orwell and Borges each discovered that art is an essential force. Both writers believed that books contain truth. It is why books were being burned in Nazi Germany. It is why Orwell sought to defend them. It is why Borges believed the library to be a labyrinth. It is why libraries remain linked to dreams, to memory, to political freedom, to educational opportunity, and to truth.
You will answer questions for...
Yeah, if people... I don't want to get in the way of the wine. Yeah, please, your question.
Questions? Here we are.
I guess I'll have a go. I found, as a postgraduate, probably hasn't been closer, I found your talk deeply inspiring, and you pressed all the right buttons until you mentioned CERN at the end there. And I thought,
Sorry.
I thought that seems slightly incongruous with everything else, because you're talking about preserving knowledge, and what is CERN but the next step in physics experimentation. I'm not a scientist either, but it seems to me that scientists fighting humanities is not an answer to any of these problems.
No, I mean, I agree. It's just there's something in me that feels that as a humanist, we've had to take an awful lot of flack recently in terms and defend ourselves from not necessarily scientists, but certainly government in terms of our purpose, and yet money on a vast scale seems to be able to be found for science. And I'm just taking a cheap jibe, basically. It's something that was, very expensive. I'll be completely honest. But I don't see why we shouldn't, because lots of people do it to us all the time. Oh, yeah.
It's not a question, really, just a comment. That talk was great. I mean, I'm a writer and I attend gatherings with various kinds of people, but it might interest people to know that at the Occupy protests outside St. Paul's, there's a library with a tent, and it's called Starbucks Library. And on the first day, it got something like 100 plus books. So yeah, libraries, and there's a tent university. So education, is very central to, I think, everything that the human mind imagines.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we have the click-through back on the class mark on the library catalogue?
Possibly. We could have a very interesting discussion over a glass of wine about the future of library catalogues. It may not interest everybody else. May interest everyone else, actually. But possibly.
It was very interesting what you said about Dewey and, and the way he envisaged the world. I wondered if you could say something a bit more about that. That was...
I've in a previous life, as a subject librarian, here actually, I remember trying to classify a biography of Mick Jagger, which amazingly we did buy for this library, using a 1914 edition of Dewey Decimal. Shall we say a heavily annotated 1914 edition of Dewey Decimal. I mean, I have heard colleagues in the profession say phrases like mark and park is enough, that cataloguing and classification are effectively dead or dying because of very, very sophisticated indexing tools, particularly from Google, but not just from Google. For the most part, and I think, I'll say this pretty confidently, for the most part, that would be the case for an awful lot of libraries that are collecting principally large quantities of multiple copies. It's not necessary to have very high-end cataloguing and very closely tailored classification schemes. For very large research libraries, as I was perhaps trying to say at the start of the talk, I think the future is much more complicated. This library is a great example. We purchase a fairly high percentage of materials from non-English speaking countries, little tiny publishers in Buenos Aires. These are not records that are freely available on the internet. So we also have the highest proportion of historic collections in any library in the UK. Now these are collections which require very highly skilled cataloguing and careful classification. So in a sense, it's great to have all of these riches. It also brings other pressures from, in terms of our budget, because these processes are very expensive. But I think there's something which, I'm just looking around to see which of my colleagues are actually there. It's something which I would be very, very careful about before defining a feature for professional cataloguers and professional classifiers, because I think in an environment such as this, they're still, highly valuable skills. There's one answer to the question. Are we about done?
I think we are.
Yeah.
It remains for me to thank you again for very thoughtful and at heart I think quite controversial series of thoughts for us to find our corner here. And to invite everyone to have a drink and a nibble with us. Along the table over there are the most recent Senate House strategy documents if you're interested in the future of the library. There's also the Friends program, and the next public event is a lecture by Alistair Black on the history and future of public libraries. And this program, which includes also visits to libraries, is open to Friends. We encourage you to join and to support the library through the Friends, and gives you an idea of the kind of work we do. That is to involve ourselves in thinking about libraries in various perspectives, and specifically this library. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chris.